Welcome to the Rooted Home Life podcast, where we talk about cultivating home and chasing adventure with our kids. I am Christina, the host of this podcast, and I am so excited, not just for today's episode, but for all of the future episodes where we will get to talk about a variety of ways that we can cultivate home and chase adventure. I feel like my guest today for our very first episode is the perfect person to start with, as she has so much experience and wisdom to share in this area of cultivating home. I love to adventure and I love to explore with my children, but I also have such a heart for cultivating a strong family culture and really a sacred space in our home. And my first guest for the podcast, Jennifer Pepito, is someone I have looked up to for years. And so it is an honor for me to get to sit down and chat with her today and to share her with you. And so she is really going to lay the foundation for us about cultivating our homes, because it is from this place of a strong home culture, of a strong family culture, that we and our children can venture out into this world together and separately in a healthy way that always brings us back home. So join me as I sit down with Jennifer Pepito and talk all about cultivating a sacred home. Hi, Jen. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Rooted Home Life, Cultivating Home and Chasing Adventure podcast. I've been so excited to have you.
Hi, Christina. I'm so excited to be here. I feel like I'm chatting with an old friend. You're just such a warm person. So anytime I get to interact with you, I just feel like, oh, it's somebody I have spent time with in person, even though we've only met once.
I know. I was really excited too, with you being one of the very first people I was going to have on. And I felt like it was the perfect fit. As I was thinking about it before meeting with you, I was even just thinking about the name, like cultivating home, chasing adventure. And I'm like, how fitting that so much of what you talk about and what you're passionate about is truly about cultivating home, with your Restoration Home podcast and your brand new book. Like it's just perfect that you would be starting out with me. So I'm so excited. For people that may not know you, could you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about who you are and all of the wonderful things about you?
For sure. Yeah, I'm Jennifer Pepito, and I've been homeschooling for 27 years. I have 7 children who are ages 30 to 15. And I'm definitely in a season of grieving a little bit, like the end of those beautiful childhood years where we were making Play-Doh together and watercolor painting. Oh, so much goodness. And I'm the founder of the Peaceful Press, which I'm super proud of. We have homeschooling resources for preschool through middle school. And then I also have a new book out called Habits for a Sacred Home that's all about 9 practices from history that can anchor and restore modern families.
All of that is so good, because I feel like I can personally speak to those facets of who you are, or at least what you put out for us to be able to like enjoy and glean from. I read Mothering by the Book in like less than a week, I think, when you came out with it. And it was just, I remember reading pieces of it to my husband and even my kids and being like, this is so good. And then I've done curriculum from the Peaceful Press with my kids. We've done Playful Pioneers, which we adored. We've done some of the preschool units, and we definitely plan to use more in the future. So I can say how amazing those have been, and having just like a really connected, relaxed, but also like rich homeschooling experience. So thank you for those. And I'm currently reading Habits for a Sacred Home. And this also, I started reading this last week. We were away on a family trip. It was a very restful trip, which is good because we've been traveling so much. And it was right on time for me, because you talked in the book a little bit about the season of writing a book and how busy you got, and how when the busyness kind of slowed down a little bit. And I'm paraphrasing, so correct me if you need to, but how you kind of looked around and you're like, okay, like some things have gotten like a little bit off kilter, and we sort of need to readjust and refocus and reset and all of that. So it so spoke to me, because I'm like, oh yeah, that I think that's where we are right now. So it's such an encouragement to me as I read it. And I just want to say this, I have so much I want to ask you, but it's really been amazing to read your books and hear you speak and share your experience, because as a mom who has not yet seen this whole process of mothering through, this whole process of homeschooling through, because I think it's a lifeline for the homeschooling mom, but not just the homeschooling mom, right? Like every single mother can get so much out of what you share. But for me, I'm like, it's like a mentor to a mom who doesn't necessarily have a mentor. That I know wonderful women and I know wonderful mothers, and I have a wonderful mother and a wonderful grandmother, but that has not necessarily walked like the same path, although no one's path is exact, like that same path in terms of homeschooling, having a strong foundation of faith be what drives your family and your family culture. So I just want to thank you, because like I don't know if you realize how many mothers that you're mentoring through sharing like your wisdom and experience. So I just want to start out
Oh,
with thank you, and then to ask you like how your personal journey has led you to these practices that you share and habits for a sacred home.
wow. Wow, Christina, you're like making me tear up here. I really appreciate it because it is like I was on a vacation with my family the last couple of days and we were mostly out of service. We could kind of get text, but Instagram wouldn't load or anything. And it was so glorious to just be there and wander in the woods with my kids and read books and I did some watercolor painting. It was glorious. And it's I know you and me both understand that having an online life is beautiful. Like we get to connect with so many amazing people around the world, but it's also a sacrifice. Do you know what I mean? It is a sacrifice. And so it's always so encouraging when you know that the time that you're sacrificing to connect with amazing moms around the world is meaning something to the Lord or meaning something to the moms. You know what I mean? So I really appreciate that. So kind. Um, Okay, so then I forgot your question. I think you were
So
asking me about the habits.
yeah, like how your personal journey that you do share has kind of like led you to these 9 practices that you talk about in the book.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's really important. It's funny because I started out as a mom very structured, okay? I wanted to be a perfect mom, and early on I found this book called Managers of Their Homes, which a lot of people do not like the people that wrote that book now because they're very very strict with their family. But it was a book. Have you ever heard of it?
I haven't,
Okay.
no.
It was like a big thing when I was a young mom of, maybe I had 4 kids at the time. Maybe I was having my fifth. It was right around then. And you would kind of like schedule out your day in 30-minute increments. And so I was, all about the habits and having a routine, having a rhythm. We had a very like child friendly structure because I had a daughter with some learning disabilities. And I'd read a lot about Charlotte Mason. And so I knew that we needed to honor the child. I'd read a lot about Montessori, where it says follow the child. And so it was very child friendly, but there was definitely a lot of really good habits. Like, everybody made their bed in the morning. We always had morning time, but we did have a few hard years. We were missionaries for almost 4 years. I talk about that in Mothering by the Book, and some years that felt kind of defeating. And so there was almost a sense where I kind of started, I feel, overdoing it on grace and just underemphasizing some of these good habits in my own life, in my family life, and I think there's a big gamut of what that means by underestimating or underemphasizing, because we still basically made our beds every day and made dinner for the family. Like I never binge watched any shows in that whole season of feeling discouraged. You know what I mean? So I know that as moms, we can have like a wide range of what underfunctioning looks like,
Right.
but still there were, I just started to see even in culture, like there's been such a move towards grace-based parenting or empathizing or being, more like understanding of emotions. And a lot of that is really important. Like we have to be connected, we have to be attuned. But if we sort of throw out all the structure and throw out all the habits, I don't think we'll be able to maintain the connection, because connection takes a little bit of self-control, a little bit of work. And that's actually the first chapter in Habits for a Sacred Home, is highlighting the power of work. Because if we're not willing to like suck it up, buttercup, and go make breakfast for your children, there's going to be chaos. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
and it's hard. Sometimes we are emotional. Sometimes we are defeated. Sometimes we are discouraged, and we're going to feel all those things. But, I loved the examples of the women that I included in Habits for a Sacred Home. Sometimes they cried in their aprons. You know what I mean? Sometimes they hid in the bathroom for a minute. And we're all going to have those moments as moms where we're feeling big feelings. But for the sake of our children, we have to keep going. We have to keep putting one foot in front of the other and create a sense of peace and presence and structure so that our children feel safe, because it does contribute to such feelings of insecurity when we are constantly all over the place emotionally even in our schedules. Like when there's some consistency, like, hey, every day we're going to read aloud together, or every day mom's going to have a little morning routine of praying, or every day we're going to have dinner together. When we have some basic habits in place, it creates so much security and peace for our children.
Yeah, like something that they can depend on, right? Like that, like there's freedom in structure, right? So sometimes like too much freedom, then it's just chaos. So I like what you said about like you can be like, grace based in the way that you parent and things like that, but still having expectations and still having structure and and modeling that for our kids, I feel like is so important.
Yeah.
So
And,
that's
and
really
I think, part of it is really staying present, and I love in the Restoration Home community, we've been tracking our time this month. So
mm,
we set a timer for every hour and we check at the end of the hour, we kind of write down what we did. And a few of the moms have already done this before. And so one of them is actually tracking her emotions. Like every hour or two, she kind of notices what she was feeling, what was going on. Because I think so often what really derails us is big emotions, and then we check out in some way, like we get on Instagram or we call somebody, like something's happening in our home that feels a little bit out of our control, and instead of sort of pressing through or journaling it out with God, we just check out and numb out.
mhm.
And that's when, even behavioral chaos can start to creep in, because if we if we continually sort of give up, like our kids are misbehaving, so we're like, fine, just go play. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if we just give up on leading our children because it's hard, which sometimes it is, then the chaos gets bigger and bigger. But if we can sort of notice, like, okay, my child hit his sister, it made me worry that he'll be an axe murderer. And so I went and got on Instagram instead of just praying for my children and maybe like modeling, like maybe acting out how you should act, or maybe reading them a story about people being nice to each other, or maybe, you know, um, like having some time where we just sang and read aloud together, like doing something that would reconnect us as a family to help us get back into a better flow. So often when these big things happen or these uncomfortable things happen, we check out and then things get worse.
That's so good, Jen. I really like the idea of tracking both the time and the emotions. I think I'm going to try that because I really want to be intentional with my time and intentional in my emotions. And actually, as you were saying that, I was thinking about I was making breakfast this morning, and knowing I had so many things going on today, it was like, maybe I'll just like make some quick scrambled eggs. I needed to make tortillas because we didn't have bread, and tortillas is like the easiest next best thing. And then I was like, almost didn't do it. And not to say like there can't be days where you're not like to your kids, make some scrambled eggs for everyone. But it really was like almost like a conviction thing for me this morning where I was like, no, like you do have the time to make the tortillas, And so as I'm cooking, I really kind of felt like that peace of the Lord settle in while I was doing it. Like I was doing what I was supposed to be doing in that moment, as silly as it sounds. Like I was supposed to make the tortillas. Well, just as I'm getting in that place, one of my younger kids started to get like really dysregulated. And when you can like hear it happening, right? And I'm like, oh, we're not moving in a good direction. And I was also on a time thing. Like we had our meeting, I have other things going on today. And it's really easy sometimes in that moment to like get snappy. Like I'm in the middle of rolling a tortilla. I don't have time to deal with your behavior, right? And that's how we can start to feel, right? We start to feel anxious and overwhelmed. And I'm so thankful because I was like, you know what? I just walked over to him and I got down on one knee and I looked him in the eyes and I was like below him, which is really helpful for him. Like you have to know your kids, right? And I was like, what's going on in your heart and your mind this morning that you're struggling so much? Like, what's happening? And he kind of like, I watched him. He was like resistant for like 2 seconds. And then he was like, I couldn't find my towel and I didn't eat yet. And I was like, I mean, that's actually huge, right? Like, I was
Huge,
like,
huge.
that's really frustrating. And I get really hangry too. And I like had his breakfast and I was like, please eat your breakfast and then someone will help you find your towel. And like,
Oh,
it shifted everything. And there's been plenty of times I didn't do that. There's been plenty of times I'm like, stop it right now, or you're not going to the pool today. You know what I
yeah.
mean? And like, obviously, they need to know that there are consequences for actions, but you also need to know your kids and the family culture that you're trying to develop and know, like, if that's really the right way
Yeah.
to go.
I love that so much, Christina, because so often our kids' behavior problems are just related to they're hungry. They need us to give them some eye contact. There's like so many things that are just part of them needing something from us.
Mm.
And if we could be more conscious of what that is, I love that you asked him and that he was able to express it. How amazing.
We're trying to work on that. So, in thinking about like how that might fit into a sacred home, like when I first saw the name of your book, I was so excited because I'm like, yes, like I feel like most moms would have that sort of like visceral reaction of like, yes, of course I want a sacred home. Yes, I want that. Some may have an idea of like what they think that is, and some may even hear that and be like what even is a sacred home? So could you speak a little bit to like when you say like habits for a sacred home, can you give us like a picture of what that is?
I love that question because I think sometimes people hear sacred and they're like, I can't be sacred. We're dealing with cranky kids here. We're dealing with dysregulated kids. There's nothing sacred about my home, but sacred just means consecrated. And
Mm,
so, as a believer in Jesus, everything that I do is consecrated to God. Everything I have is consecrated to God. And so my home is just one more place where I loved Charlotte Mason said, I can't remember. Now I get this mixed up because I feel like I think Charlotte Mason said this, but I think also Benedict said this. But Charlotte Mason said that you have come to someone was coming to her teacher college, and she said you've come to a school for the service of the Lord.
mm,
And I think about my home that way. Like this is a home for the service of the Lord. And so even though it doesn't always feel very sacred. Like, I'm trying to make sure my kids they're not on social media too much. I've got teens. I'm trying to make sure that we read the Bible together every day. I'm trying to make sure that my husband and I are sweet and kind to each other. Do you know what I mean? There's all these things that I'm also in the fight with all of you, trying to live as if my home is consecrated to God. And sometimes it's hard, but it's not about perfection. It's not about being there. It's about that I've acknowledged that my home is God's. And so I'm going to keep returning to God every day, even though I'm going to make mistakes too. And actually, I just Cindy Rollins has a newsletter and she just sent it out. And there was a poem in there by George MacDonald and says, what I have done, Lord, make it clean with thy forgiveness, dear, that so today what might have been tomorrow may appear. And it says, and when my thought is all astray, yet think thou on in me, that with the newborn innocent day, my soul rise fresh and free. And I just love that idea that every day his mercies are new. And so we can forgive our children for having tantrums, for messing up our sacred home, for messing up our sacred image, for all the ways that they make our life uncomfortable. We can forgive ourselves for all the ways that we don't act according to what we know we could do. We have all these heroes, like in Habits for a Sacred Home. There's so many women that we can look up to who are calm in the face of a crisis. And so then why do we like have a little meltdown, or why do we get so scared and hopeless when a bill comes in or our children misbehave? So we have all these examples, but sometimes we're going to blow it. And so recognizing that his mercies are new every day, and every day is like this new opportunity to just be a child of God again and be a sweet mom again, even if yesterday you weren't.
yeah, that's so good because we have like the opportunity to like model what making a mistake and then handling it the right way looks like, asking for forgiveness. I mean, I even have plenty of times where I have to tell my kids, like, I'm asking you for forgiveness. And I also have repented before the Lord and asked his forgiveness because I didn't handle the situation right. And I'm really sorry,
Yeah.
because they aren't going to be perfect either, as much as we want them, to grasp everything perfectly and we want to do everything perfectly. Like that's not the reality. So I'm thinking about like how we talk to, like how we model these things, how we sort of set up this sacred atmosphere and consecration to the Lord, but then like how can you encourage moms to like how do we communicate that to our kids and even of our spouses, because we all want to be on the same page, and although we can't rely on them to do it, like this is something like we've decided, how can we kind of like try to help them understand what we're shooting for and like be on the same page?
Yeah, that's such a good question. One, I think I talk about this in the book actually, because there was one winter where there were some distressing situations happening around us. And I was really caught up in it and feeling very discouraged. And my dad came to me and he said, you know, you're the cheerleader of this operation. And you know, if you can't, like, I don't remember how he finished what he said, but it was basically like, you need to pick yourself up and put a smile on because everybody's feeling what you're feeling. And I think that's so true. Like we do set the tone. And so it's not like I don't, you know, all of my children might not be as like spiritually minded as me all the time. And I'm not saying I'm just so godly, but you know, I I'm hungry for God. My children might not always be exactly the same, but there's so many beautiful stories of even children who were not, and the prayers of their mother turned them around. Do you know what I mean? And you can even see that like in Ruth Bell Graham, her son Frank, who, you know, he kind of like went off or something. He was like a wild child, and he's the head of the whole ministry now, or some, I think Samaritan Purse maybe is what he's in charge of. But it's like there's we do set the tone. And so even if our family, like maybe, you know, maybe your husband doesn't want to lead family devotions, we'll just read a psalm at dinner time. Like maybe your
Right.
children aren't like super excited about their faith. We'll just add in some prayer and scripture reading as part of your homeschool morning time. Like you don't have to wait for people's permission to to do what God's laid on your heart. And obviously there's a way of being respectful about it with our husbands where we don't totally step on their toes. But I think sometimes we're more stepping on their toes when we're like, oh, I need you to lead family devotions. You know what I mean? It's
Right.
like you could say, hey, I'd love it if you read the Bible to the kids. But if they don't want to, then just read the Bible to the kids. Like I think that we, you know, sometimes we wait for circumstances to be ideal or things to be perfect. And I think it's better to just do something.
Yeah, I love that so much because it can be defeating if it doesn't look like your ideal, right? Like I would really love for it to look like this. And then if it can't look like that, I feel like sometimes we can like give up or just become like bitter and just be like, well, then not for my family. I guess it won't be that. So
Totally.
for the mom that really like feels the weight of that, like this looks nothing like what I hoped it would be. We are so far from anything feeling or looking sacred at all. Like what what would be your advice for like a first, like where do I even start? Things are so chaotic, so off kilter, so far from where I would like us to be. Like what's my first step?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, Christine. And honestly, I do feel like forgiveness is always the first step because I think that often as mothers, we set out trying to be a perfect mom. And we are probably partly thinking about the way we were parented and thinking about how we're going to do things differently than we were parented. And so it can become almost an idol in our hearts that I'm going to do things different. And so then we maybe even set ourselves up for failure by having this like reactionary vision. And I think if we can just make it a very constant practice of forgiving our parents, forgiving our husbands for the ways they're not doing things the way we want them to,
Mm-hmm.
forgiving ourselves, forgiving our children, I feel like what that does is it helps us be more sensitive to the way God is leading. Because there's, you know, there's all these like these habits, these spiritual disciplines that will make a difference in our homes, like praying with your children or praying for your children. It will make a difference. Reading the scriptures aloud or reading them to yourself, it will make a difference. But if we are, you know, constantly kind of holding other people in judgment, holding our parents in judgment, like I have a friend who, as long as I've known her, I have a couple friends like this, they've always complained about their husbands, like, oh, he won't do this, oh, he won't do that. And it's like, in a way, they were kind of waiting for him to set the tone. And over the years, their families grown, like there's more chaos than ever. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if, and I don't live in their shoes, so I have no idea what all they've dealt with. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But I feel like if we could just continue because life is not perfect. Like the another Cindy Rollins poem that she sent out was the Christina Rossetti uphill poem. It's like life is hard sometimes. Life, it's not perfect. We are going to have opposition in a way. And that was another one of the excerpts in my book. I read a prayer, or I write a prayer from Amy Carmichael, talking about how we're touching the very center. The fight we've been called to is not an easy fight. We're touching the very center of the devil's power and kingdom, and he fights hard against us. Do you know what I
Mm.
mean? When we're raising children, like, we are basically like the first church. Do you know what I mean? The foundation of a healthy church is a healthy family. And so, of course, the enemy doesn't want us to succeed in this super, super important um, endeavor. You know what I mean? An endeavor to raise our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, to talk about him as we rise up and as we lie down. And so I think forgiveness really is the key to being able to get yourself back up every day and brush off the frustrations and brush off the disappointments and brush off your own failures, and just do it again with joy, and love again with joy, and pray again with hope, and just continue to sow the seeds, because we're just like sowing the seeds, but God's the one who makes the harvest grow.
Yeah, I love that so much because as we talked a little bit about like asking for forgiveness and modeling forgiveness, that's like the other side of the coin, right? Like the forgiving, like doing the forgiving, like being someone who's quick to ask for forgiveness and being someone who will work through forgiving others. Like both of those things can be really hard, like admitting that you were wrong and then also accepting like that someone else was wrong, but you are choosing to let it go and like give it to the Lord and then like be able to move forward because that's what the unforgiveness does is like it traps us from being able to move forward too.
Exactly,
That's like
exactly. I'm
really,
glad you
really,
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm not going to forgive them. They don't deserve it. Like, they're so bad. They do not deserve my forgiveness. But it's not about that. Like, God, the Bible says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Do you know what I mean? So it's not about releasing them from their punishment. It's about releasing us from their punishment, because
right,
bitterness is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die. It doesn't work. It says bitterness dries up the bones. And so it's about us staying healthy, and letting God, like, just putting a little wall between us and those who've offended us, and letting God take care of them, instead of, and especially when it's our own family, like it's our own husband or our children. Do you know what I mean? Because
yeah,
how does it help us to carry a grudge towards our husband, the father of our children? Do you know what I mean? How does it help us to carry a grudge towards our children, our very own offspring? Do you know what I mean? It does not serve anybody
right,
well. Like if if you need to go to a counselor and work through things with a counselor, do it. But holding a grudge towards the person you share a bed with, or the person who you're raising your children with, or the children, is just
right,
so unproductive. It's so
yeah,
unproductive.
yeah. I one thing that I often when scripture, I guess I say thing, but it's scripture to say I say to them because obviously like siblings are going to have disagreements and fights and all of the things. And I try to remind them like a house divided against itself can't stand. So I
Mhm.
can do all of these wonderful things. I can be a great cook and clean and create a beautiful home and all of these things. But if we're divided, we're in trouble. Right. And so can you speak to like what are some examples of unhealthy habits? Like you talk about all of these sacred practices, which are so helpful, but then what can we like be on the lookout for? Like what are some of the unhealthy habits that we might want to start with to target like, yes, I want to be praying and yes, I want to work hard and all of these things. And at the same time, what are some unhealthy habits that we might want to like be able to identify and kind of get
Yeah.
out of the family culture?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think probably the two most unhealthy habits are checking out and parenting out of shame.
Mm,
And with parenting out of shame, like, I did this early on. I was sort of hoping my children would make me look good.
mm,
And so then if they didn't make me look good, then I would correct them, not from a sense of love for them or concern for their soul, but more out of like, oh my gosh, you embarrassed me.
Mm.
And children can always pick up on that. Like when we were in a Christian culture that was very legalistic in a lot of ways. Like there were
Mm.
certain clothes you could wear, and there's a lot of like, oh, that's not. There's a lot of judgment in a way,
Right.
and so then I, was always sort of judging others and myself and my children through that lens.
Mm.
But children pick up on those motives. You know what I mean? They're not impressed by it.
Right.
And so, when you like your child doesn't do their co-op presentation very well, and then you're like, oh, they didn't really practice, or you say something embarrassing, you embarrass them basically in front of everybody instead
Right.
of just like, okay, when you feel ashamed, instead you kind of just have to sit there for a minute. Like I would be embarrassed about my children's presentation, say, but if I didn't get them to practice ahead of time, then the day of the presentation was not the time to embarrass them because I was embarrassed. And so I
Right.
really just needed to keep my mouth shut or say, hey, thanks for doing that. Or, you know what I mean? Like I needed to say something encouraging and just push through and let it go. Or, a child has a temper tantrum at co-op. Like these kinds of things, it's easy when you're in those moments to say something shaming in front of your child or to your child because you're embarrassed.
Mm.
And it creates a bigger problem. Whereas if you can just push through the feeling, like, okay, you feel embarrassed, it's uncomfortable, but you'll get through that. You'll have better days. Everyone's been there. And so
Yeah.
don't open your mouth and then heap shame on your children because you're embarrassed. And probably like so often when our children embarrass us, it's because we did check out and didn't make them practice, or we didn't pack a good enough lunch, or I mean there's some kind of preparation on
Mm.
our side that probably is contributing to that.
Mm.
And so it feels uncomfortable, but just push through and don't shame your children because you feel ashamed.
Mm.
And I think, the more we grow in the Lord and recognize that our identity is safe in him, the less we feel embarrassed. And the less embarrassed we are, the more power we have. You know what I mean? Because if we're not always looking for who's judging us, then there's a lot of like fun that we can have and a lot of joy that we can carry in our family if we're not easily embarrassed. Like sometimes I will on purpose embarrass my kids, um, like asking silly questions of strangers or things like that, just for
Right.
the fun of it. But because I have like no shame, like nobody, and I'm sure that could be tested. Like I don't want to say that on like a live video. I'm sure that could be tested.
Right.
Like, but I think that when we can get as much as possible, like have that false self or whatever broken down and just be hidden in Christ, then you can have a lot more fun with your kids and be a lot less worried about, are my children keeping up? Am I doing enough? Am I a failure as a mother? You know what I mean? It's like when we're just like the sheep of his pasture, just like little sweet children who are innocently playing in the field and trusting that God's going to work things out, then there's so much more fun and power and joy that we can have in our families. And then checking out, it's almost the same. It's like we feel like we made a mistake, our children are fighting, we feel all these things underneath, like hopeless, discouraged, afraid, embarrassed, so many things. But then we don't know how to deal with it and it's too uncomfortable. So then we start scrolling Instagram and letting the kids fight and make their own food and make a big mess. And it's like I think most of us
And
in
then
this
be
age of
angry at
social
the
media,
mess.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I think most of us in this age of social media can relate to doing that. Like just, feeling a little hopeless, a little discouraged. Like there's so many situations that are hard, like, trying to discipline a child and they just don't seem to get it, or trying to teach a child reading and they don't seem to get it. There's so many situations that are really hard and can be very tempting to just check out. And it's like if you do that one day, it's not going to be the end of the world. Like, but if you make a lifestyle of checking out when it's hard, then like I've known people who like their kids, like they think their kids have dyslexia, but really they just haven't been consistent about like just a little bit of daily phonics, just a
Mm.
little bit of daily writing. Do you know what I mean? Just like like just consistent basics will go a long way. But when we're constantly like, oh, they don't want to do their score today, and so we just throw up our hands and we walk away. You know what I mean? When we consistently check out because it's hard, we're not going to make progress. And I know it's hard, but the rewards are there. And if you don't like the funny thing is, if we don't put in the work early to train the habits, we're going to be doing it later. And I have done this with some of my kids, you know, not necessarily put in the work earlier because of shame, because of confusion, whatever. But then you're still going to do it at some point. You're gonna pay the piper at some point. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
so if you can do it early.
Yeah, it will rear its ugly head eventually, right? My goodness. Um, I feel like that's helpful because sometimes in those seasons of overwhelm or busyness, it can be easy to kind of like let some of those things slide. And while, yes, we do as moms with so many things on our plates have to pick our battles, like we can't be like that nitpicker mom that's like, they can't breathe. But I think we do have to be like really intentional about like, what are the important things that I really do have to make sure are kept in order and in balance so that we don't find ourselves down the road having to deal with a bigger problem later. I feel like that's like really important to think about.
Yeah.
Really
And
helpful.
that's one reason to have like age appropriate and simplified homeschooling
Mm,
because we create a lot more fights for ourselves. You know, for instance, like a lot of math curriculum has way more problems than your child really needs to do. Do you know what I mean?
yes.
If you don't have the confidence to just like do what you think they need for review, maybe do some orally, then you're going to have daily tears over math. Or you know, it's like a lot of people choose a say language arts curriculum that is overbearing, like it has way too many subjects, maybe even too much writing for a young child.
Right.
Not all young children are ready to do a lot of writing before age 10. And
Right.
so if you choose resources that are um overbearing or have a lot of busy work, then you're actually creating some of those tensions yourself. Whereas you can accomplish the same thing by reading out loud, having them tell you back what they read, doing some consistent math and copy work every day. If you do those basics, your children are going to be getting a great education. But if you're constantly like adding on more things and then having fights every day, just maybe back off a little bit and go back to where you can get through a day with peace.
It's so funny that you say that because in the practical sense, right? As someone who like went to public school and taught in public school and two of my children did attend public school in the beginning, like how many times do you see like their homework or their assignment is like do the odds or the evens? Have you seen that? Like the
Oh
teacher
yeah, of
will
course.
assign them to do the even problems and it's because there are too many. And
Yeah.
then sometimes like us as homeschool moms, we think like no, like we have to do the whole thing, right? We have to, and some of that comes out of like us wanting to like do a good job, but I feel like some of that can go back to like, I don't know if you said fear, but like kind of like alluding to almost like that fear and that shame of like not doing good enough, not doing it right, not doing enough. And so I feel like finding the balance, right, between like having good structure and rhythms and expectations, but also not needing to be like letter of the law about everything to the point that it creates this tense atmosphere that you're talking about is like such wisdom. Like
Hmm.
knowing that it's not like one or the other, like where I'm
Right.
just completely lax or I'm completely rigid. It's like I can find this beautiful balance in
Totally.
between that creates this nice culture in my home.
Yeah. And it's all about knowing our kids because some kids can handle more and they're just, you know, if they're fighting with you, it's just because they want to fight maybe. And some kids can't handle more. And we have to know which is appropriate for my child in which season, you know, and just continue making progress, but stop like comparing or feeling this pressure to do everything that everybody else is doing.
Yeah, that's so good. So something that I loved in Habits of a Sacred Home, and I'm still reading it, but something that I loved about it, and I feel like you did this in a similar but different way in Mothering by the Book. So like in Mothering by the Book, there was kind of like this, I guess, like triangulation between you and your experiences and God's wisdom and principles from the Bible, from scripture, and then a book that kind of like connected those things together. And then like Habits for a Sacred Home, it was similar in a sense that it was like your lived experience and wisdom with God's principles from scripture and his truth. And then like a real woman in history that you are drawing an example of like how to actually practically do this from. And I know you picked the ones that you love, but is there one that you're like, if I had to pick one, like this is the story that I want. If I could only share one with you, like this is the one.
I mean, that is really hard actually, because each one of them is so impressive to me and such an encouragement. And it's like, I think the two who probably are the most up there in a way are probably Edith Schaefer and Madeline L'Engle. I think partly because, they're in a way, they're both a little messy. Like Edith Schaefer just accomplished so much, worked so hard, but I don't think she was such like a perfectionist in her life in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like I feel like they were real people in a sense. And then Madeline L'Engle, same, like in a way, a little bit messy, but also, really love the Lord. And so I'm encouraged by people like that who are faithful, who don't give up on their faith, even when, like Edith Schaefer had a son who wrote a very critical book about her family. And
Wow.
later on in life, sort of repented of that in her, like wrote an obituary in honor of his mom, where he sort of repented of what he said. But just continued on with like grace and dignity despite hardships, and wrote so many beautiful, encouraging books for families, you know, just that faithfulness. And I think that's really what we need as moms, is just to keep being faithful, like keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when you're in a season of feeling like, oh, this child's behavior problems are never going to get better, or this child's never going to learn to read, or the child's never going to potty train, like whatever season you're in, recognizing that the faithful will eat the good of the land. That's what it says in the Bible. He who endures to the end will be saved. And so much of motherhood and marriage and even faith is just about being steady. Like just keep on putting one foot in front of the other and doing the right thing, even when you don't feel like it, even when you're hormonal, even when you've been disappointed by people, by your children, by your husband, by the church, whatever. Just keep being faithful and having hope and faith. And I think that it's those of us who continue being faithful. It's like the Bible says in Psalm 37. I love this psalm. It says, yet a little while and the wicked will be no more. You'll look for his place and it will not be, but the meek will inherit the earth and delight themselves in the abundance of peace. And so just that meek and quiet and faithful spirit of continuing to try has a great reward.
That's so good, Jen. Thank you so much. That was kind of like what I anticipated you would share, in a sense of like that overwhelming theme of faithfulness and just continuing to push forward, because I feel like I see that theme when you share, like in both of the books. But as I'm currently working through this one, it's like what I love about what you share, I'll say this, is that you have such a strong faith and you have a lot of wisdom, but you don't shy away from sharing like the real moments where you've missed it. And I feel like, and then of course, you're always following it up with like, and then this is what I did next. Even if you didn't say like, this is what I did next, it's like this encouragement for moms where they can see like that rhythm of faithfulness, that like, okay, I might have missed the mark here. Things got a little bit off track, but we recorrected and like we remained faithful, and I remained faithful. And I feel like that's such a huge encouragement, because we can sometimes see this ideal mom and think that we cannot relate at all because we'll never be her. But when we
Mm-hmm.
hear of like, no, like there is a reality where I have to choose to continue to be faithful, where I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I've missed the mark, or my child is missing the mark, or there's chaos happening around us. I feel like that's so encouraging. It's like a lifeline to the mom that feels like she's so far from that place of being faithful, or struggling in a particular season to remain faithful. So
Yeah.
I did want to ask you to share a little bit about how people can connect with you. Like, how can moms continue to get wisdom from Jennifer Pepito, just from your book and from all the other places that you share all of your experiences and wisdom with us moms who are like so desperate to hear, like, keep going.
Yeah, I think probably the best places are the Peaceful Press. If you go to the Instagram, or if you go to my book page, habitsforasacredhome.com, and put in your order number, there's a bunch of freebies. But if you get on my newsletter, that's where a lot of the sharing happens. And then also the podcast, like the Restoration Home podcast, is where we're talking about just being connected families and restored communities is the byline. So we're just talking there about all these topics of staying connected even in the midst of hardship, and continuing to be faithful even when the circumstances may not be ideal.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Jen. This has been such a pleasure to get to sit and talk with you. And I feel like this is going to be such an encouragement to so many moms. So thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Christina. What a joy to get to chat with you today.
Well, I hope you enjoyed getting to listen in on this conversation with Jennifer Pepito. She is just such a pleasure to chat with and to learn from. I will put all of her contact info in the show notes so that you can continue to follow along on her journey and be encouraged and inspired by it. On our next episode, I'm going to be sitting down with Dorinda Wilson, and she is going to be talking to us all about raising boys. So for all of my boy moms out there, you are not going to want to miss this episode. She is amazing. She has raised 5 boys into adulthood. And so make sure you follow the Rooted Home Life podcast so you do not miss an episode. They will be releasing bi-weekly, and we will be talking about all facets of cultivating home and chasing adventure. I hope to see you soon here on the Rooted Home Life podcast. Until next time, stay rooted.